A plant common enough to appear in every lawn, every sidewalk crack, every abandoned lot across temperate climates contains more vitamin A than spinach, more calcium than kale by some measures, and concentrations of vitamin K high enough to meet daily requirements in a single serving. Every part of it is edible: root, leaf, flower, stem. It blooms earlier than almost any other plant, providing critical nutrition when nothing else grows. For centuries, it was cultivated in kitchen gardens across Europe and North America. Then the suburbs taught us it was ugly, and the chemical industry taught us how to kill it. There is a plant that grows in soil no other crop will tolerate: compacted earth, cracked pavement, the hard-packed dirt along highways where salt accumulates and nothing thrives. It grows there, not struggling, not barely surviving, thriving. Its root descends straight down, sometimes a foot or more, breaking through layers of clay and hardpan that would stop most plants at the surface. Where the ground has been stripped, degraded, or poisoned by neglect, this plant is often the first to colonize, and it is not marginal in nutrition. The leaves contain more vitamin A than spinach, often twice as much depending on season and soil. They contain more calcium than kale by some analyses, more iron than many cultivated greens, and concentrations of vitamin K so high that a single serving exceeds recommended daily intake. The root, when dried and roasted, has been used for centuries as a coffee substitute, not because coffee was unavailable, but because the root was valued in its own right. The flowers produce a honey-like syrup and have been fermented into wine. The young stems, blanched to reduce bitterness, were eaten like asparagus. Nothing is wasted. Not the leaves, not the root, not the flower, not the stem. This is not a plant that happens to be edible. This is a plant that was eaten, deliberately and systematically, across continents and centuries, because it delivered nutrition when cultivated crops had not yet matured, or had already failed. The historical record is unambiguous. In medieval Europe, this plant was not foraged reluctantly. It was grown. Kitchen gardens included it alongside onions, cabbage, and herbs. It was harvested in early spring when vitamin deficiencies from winter diets, scurvy, night blindness, weakness, began to manifest in populations that had survived months on grain, salt meat, and stored roots. The leaves appeared before lettuce, before spinach, before any intentional crop had broken dormancy. They were eaten fresh, cooked in soups, or wilted with fat and vinegar. The bitterness was understood as medicinal, something that stimulated digestion after months of heavy preserved foods. By the 16th century, European herbalists were cataloging it with clinical precision. The plant was described as a diuretic, as something that increased urine output and supported the liver. The French called it pissenlit, a name that translates bluntly to wet the bed. The observation was not metaphorical. The effect was real, documented across generations of use, and considered valuable. But unlike pharmaceutical diuretics, which can deplete potassium and create dangerous imbalances, this plant was rich in potassium. It flushed the system without depleting it. Traditional healers understood this balance even if they did not understand the chemistry. When Europeans crossed the Atlantic, they brought the seeds deliberately, not as an accident, not as a contaminant in grain shipments, as a crop. It was planted in the kitchen gardens of colonial settlements, cultivated by people who knew that survival in a new climate required reliable sources of early-season nutrition. Native American communities, who had their own food systems refined over millennia, adopted it. The plant spread rapidly across the continent, thriving in the disturbed soils that followed European agriculture. It was eaten, traded, and incorporated into indigenous foodways alongside native greens. By the 19th century, seed catalogs in the United States sold improved varieties, cultivars with larger leaves, cultivars with less bitterness. This was not a wild plant being tolerated. This was a crop being improved, selected, and sold to gardeners who wanted it. During the Great Depression, when industrial food systems failed and millions faced hunger, this plant fed families who had no money for groceries. It grew in yards, in fields, along roadsides. It required no purchase, no planting, no care. People who remembered how to recognize it, how to prepare it, how to reduce the bitterness, those people ate. During the Second World War, when governments across Europe and North America promoted victory gardens to reduce pressure on rationed food supplies, this plant was included in guides to edible wild plants. Posters instructed citizens on identification. Pamphlets explained preparation. It was not hidden knowledge. It was public health policy. The plant had been eaten, cultivated, documented, and valued for at least 1,000 years of continuous European history, and longer in other regions. It appeared in medical texts, in agricultural manuals, in household records. It was ordinary. It was everywhere. It was food. And then, in the span of 2 decades, it became the enemy. The plant did not change. But after 1945, the American landscape did. Suburban development exploded. Millions of homes, built on identical plans, spread across farmland that had been converted to housing tracts. Each home came with a yard, and each yard was expected to conform to a new aesthetic: the lawn. The lawn was not a garden. It was not a space for production. It was a space for display. A monoculture of grass, uniform in height and color, trimmed weekly, treated as a symbol of order and prosperity. Anything that was not grass was, by definition, wrong. The plant that had been food, that had been medicine, that had been cultivated in kitchen gardens for centuries, became classified as a weed. Not because it harmed the grass, not because it depleted the soil, because it was visible, because it flowered, because it disrupted the uniformity. And an entire industry emerged to eliminate it. Chemical herbicides, developed during the war for agricultural and military purposes, were rebranded for residential use. Lawn care companies offered services to spray, treat, and maintain weed-free grass. Advertising campaigns taught homeowners that a lawn with flowering plants was a lawn neglected, a sign of poor maintenance, even moral failure. The same plant that had fed families during the Depression was now something to be ashamed of. The economic logic was clear. A plant that grows without input, that reseeds itself, that requires no purchase and no ongoing maintenance, has no value to an industry built on selling products: grass seed, fertilizer, herbicide, mowing services. The lawn was not a habitat. It was a market. The plant could not be sold. It could not be controlled. It could not be contained within rows or harvested by machine. It spread wherever it was allowed, and in a system that demanded control, that made it a problem. The bitterness, which had once been understood as medicinal, was now used as evidence of inedibility. Modern palates, shaped by decades of sweet and processed foods, rejected anything that tasted strong, sharp, or challenging. The fact that the bitterness could be reduced by blanching, by harvesting young leaves, by pairing with fats or acids, that knowledge was no longer transmitted. Cookbooks stopped including it. Seed catalogs stopped selling it. Agricultural extension offices, which had once distributed guides to its identification and use, began distributing guides to its eradication. By the 1970s, an entire generation had grown up believing that this plant was trash, that it had no purpose, that a responsible homeowner removed it on site. The plant continued to grow. It had not stopped growing. It could not be stopped. But it fed no one. Modern nutritional analysis has confirmed what centuries of traditional use suggested. The leaves are among the most nutrient-dense greens available. A 100-gram serving of raw leaves provides over 100% of the daily requirement for vitamin K, over 50% for vitamin A, and significant amounts of vitamin C, vitamin E, folate, calcium, iron, magnesium, and potassium. Protein content, while modest in absolute terms, is comparable to spinach and other cultivated leafy greens. The leaves are digestible raw, though bitterness is reduced by cooking or by harvesting before the plant flowers. The root contains inulin, a prebiotic fiber that supports gut bacteria. It contains sesquiterpene lactones, compounds that stimulate bile production and have been studied for their role in liver function. Traditional use of the root as a liver tonic is not folklore detached from biology. It is observation that aligns with measurable biochemical activity. The flowers contain antioxidants, including polyphenols and carotenoids. They have been used to make syrups, infused oils, and fermented beverages. The young flower buds, harvested before they open, have been pickled and used as a caper substitute. From an ecological perspective, The plant is a keystone species in degraded landscapes. Its taproot breaks compacted soil. As the root grows and eventually decomposes, it creates channels that allow water and air to penetrate deeper layers. This benefits other plants, which can follow the dandelion into ground that was previously impermeable. The root pulls minerals, calcium, potassium, magnesium, from deep in the subsoil and deposits them in the leaves. When the leaves die back, those minerals are returned to the surface, enriching the topsoil. The plant functions as a biological pump, moving fertility upward. It blooms early, often in late winter or very early spring, when almost nothing else is flowering. For pollinators emerging from winter dormancy, this early nectar source is critical. Bees, butterflies, and other insects depend on it during a period when food is otherwise scarce. The plant is perennial. Once established, it returns year after year without replanting. It produces thousands of seeds per plant, dispersed by wind across distances that can exceed a mile under the right conditions. It tolerates mowing. Cutting the leaves does not kill the root, which regenerates within days. It tolerates drought. The deep taproot accesses water that shallow-rooted plants cannot reach. It tolerates cold. It tolerates heat. It tolerates poor soil, salt, pollution, and neglect. It is nearly impossible to eradicate without persistent chemical intervention. And even then, seeds remain viable in the soil for years, waiting for conditions that allow germination. From a survival perspective, this is a plant designed to persist. From a food security perspective, this is a plant that provides nutrition without inputs, without cultivation, without cost. But there is no infrastructure, there is no market, there is no commercial supply chain. The plant is free, abundant, and nutritionally superior to crops that require irrigation, fertilizer, and annual replanting. But it cannot be sold in the form it grows. And so, in the logic of industrial food systems, it remains worthless. The plant is called dandelion. The name comes from the French Dandelion, lion's tooth, a reference to the jagged shape of the leaves. It is known by dozens of other names across the languages and regions where it grows. In Chinese medicine, it is called pugong ying. In German, Löwenzahn. In Italian, dente di leone. The names differ. The plant does not. It grows today across every continent except Antarctica. In North America, Europe, Asia, South America, Australia, anywhere temperate climates exist, dandelion establishes readily. It is found in cities, in suburbs, in farmland, in wilderness. It is, by some measures, one of the most successful plants on Earth. The leaves are low-growing, forming a rosette that lies close to the ground. The edges are toothed, often deeply lobed, giving the plant its lion's tooth name. The flowers are bright yellow, composite, made up of dozens of tiny florets packed into a single head. After flowering, the seeds form the familiar white sphere, a structure of delicate filaments that children blow apart and adults spray with poison. The root is thick, fleshy, white inside, and brittle when fresh. When dried and roasted, it develops a dark color and a flavor that resembles coffee, earthy, slightly bitter, with none of the caffeine. Harvest is simple. The leaves are cut at the base, ideally before the flower stalk emerges, when bitterness is lowest. The root is dug with a trowel or fork, washed, and can be used fresh or dried. The flowers are picked when fully open, on a dry day, and used immediately or preserved. For foragers, dandelion is among the easiest plants to identify and among the safest to eat. There are no toxic lookalikes in North America or Europe that share its combination of features: toothed leaves in a basal rosette, hollow flower stalk, milky sap, composite yellow flower. It grows in accessible places: parks, lawns, roadsides, vacant lots. It is available earlier in the season than most other wild greens, and it persists later into autumn. In mild climates, it can be harvested nearly year-round. It never required domestication. It never required breeding programs or genetic selection. It grew, and people ate it, for as long as people have lived in climates where it thrives. And it is still here, still growing in the cracks of parking lots, still blooming in February, in March, when pollinators are desperate and nothing else flowers. still producing leaves that are more nutritious than most of what is sold in supermarkets. Still poisoned, still pulled, still treated as the enemy of order. The knowledge was always here. It was written in herbals, in medical texts, in the instructions given to victory gardeners during wartime. It was practiced by grandmothers who survived the Depression, by immigrants who brought seeds across oceans, by foragers who never stopped looking. We just stopped listening.